structural challenges in its foreign drug inspection program, including staff retention, translation issues, and the need for advanced coordination with foreign governments and companies to inspect a plant's operations. And I hope Congress can be a partner to FDA as it explores how to reinvigorate its foreign inspection programs in the aftermath of COVID-19 when travel restrictions impeded its ability to work abroad. At the same time, we should also recognize that new tools will be required to keep tabs on our growing global market and keep Americans safe. For example, FDA has requested additional authorities to conduct remote inspections, which could include live streaming videos of plant operations, teleconferences, and screen sharing technologies. These proposals would allow FDA to protect the public health when its capacity for in-person inspections is stretched thin, like during public health emergencies. So I hope Congress can come together and figure out how to support FDA as it explores new tools to address the challenges of a global market. It's important that we work together to give FDA the resources and authorities it needs to strengthen its foreign inspection programs to protect Americans. All I'm simply asking my colleagues on the other side, we understand that FDA has challenges. We understand they have limited resources and limited staff. But the answer is to provide them with more resources and more staff and more authority, not to say that we should scrap them. Some have advocated we shouldn't even have an FDA, or that we should, cut back on the money we give them, or somehow say, okay, well, we don't inspect abroad, so we shouldn't inspect here either, because it has to be equal. I mean, that's not the answer. So with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, and the panel. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. That concludes member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made a part of the record, but we do ask that you provide those opening statements to the clerk properly so we can get them into the record. We also want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. You all will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from the members. Our witnesses today are Dinesh Thakur, public health activist at the Thakur Family Foundation; John Claud, counsel for Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara; and finally, Mary Denigan-Macauley, who comes here often. We thank you for being here. Director of Public Health at the Government Accountability Office. We appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. You're aware that this committee is holding an oversight hearing, and when doing so, it is our practice to take that testimony under oath. Do any of you have an objection to testifying under oath? Seeing that none of the panel objected, we will proceed. The chair advises that you are also entitled to be advised by legal counsel pursuant to House rules. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? Again, the witnesses have indicated that they do not desire to have counsel with them. So if you all would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And seeing the witnesses answered in the affirmative, you are now sworn in and under oath, subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, we will now recognize Mr. Thakur for 5 minutes to give his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee. I thank you for having me here to offer my testimony to you on this very important topic that affects all of us. My background and my training is in my written statement. What I wanted to do for my verbal statement was to basically review the observations of the US FDA when they, over the last 10 years while they've inspected facilities overseas, and highlight some of the challenges that they face and potentially what we could do, you could do, to try and address some of these issues here. When the member, Ms. Rogers, was speaking, she highlighted to a fact that last year we had a problem with eye drops, the fact that they were contaminated, that a lot of people lost their sight, and some people lost their life. These inspection reports that the US FDA produces and makes them available, they have a litany of things that they observe, which are in contravention of Code of Federal Regulations CFR 211, which is our rule book. And what they do is they document this so that both the company and the public knows what really happens. A lot of these are complicated chemistry issues, but what I wanted to do today was to pick up those that don't require a chemist to interpret, but potentially want the larger audience here to understand the issues that we're facing with. Now, this particular company that's based in India that sold eye drops to us And this is an observation from, this report that was published. And actually, you know what, let me start with cisplatin. There's a cancer drug called cisplatin that was in shortage all of last year. And this company was based in India that provides this genetic cisplatin to oncology-related patients. And one of the observations in the 2023 inspections, this is what the observation is. It says, our investigators observed plastic bags of torn and discarded documents in your quality control scrap area under a stairwell and on a truck outside your facility. And it also says that an analyst was observed pouring acetic acid in a trash bin to destroy analytical balance slips. And a QC employee stated that he observed the analyst destroying other information as well. Now, how is this acceptable? Let me go back and read another report from November 2023, a company called Natco Pharma, and this is directly taken from the inspector's observations in the Form 483. It says, upon putting together some of the torn pieces of documents with the help of your own employees, your quality management unit stated that the torn pieces belong to an original record, raw data. Now, I know that a lot of what the FDA says and what is reported to you is about falsifying data. Now, imagine if this happened in Enron, and you basically said that you would actually impose a financial penalty on Enron, which is what the FDA does with the import alert. It basically hits the company ability to export to the United States and let Skilling and Lay go scot-free. Is that going to be acceptable to us? Let me read to you another company. These are observations from 10 years ago, okay? I'm looking at observations that are made in July 2014 of a company, and the inspectors were Peter Baker and Joanne King. And these drugs that we're inspecting were metoprolol tartrate and furosemide, two medicines that are used in cardiovascular. If you have hypertension, these are the medications that are given to them, and these are lifelong medications. It says that our review of the QC data found raw data had been manipulated and results deleted. It says that backdating, falsifying temperature records. And one of the analysts, upon questioning, said that she had been forced to falsify records by her direct supervisor. A few months later, in October 2024, investigators Peter Baker and Deepesh Shah, they made these following observations. They said, overwriting and deleting raw data records. We noted duplicate results of the same sample. Original report was not included. Partially shredded training evaluation forms. 5 years go by. In August of 2019, another set of investigators, Arshan Karpetia and Pratik Upadhyaya, they went back to the same company, and this is what they wrote in the record. Compromised the integrity of outer space investigation by changing the HPLC system. The HPLC system is a test system that actually tests the quality of medicine that is produced. When these kind of things actually happen, and we have no ability to hold the management accountable over the last 10 years, and we have a record of these, how exactly do you expect these companies to actually fall in line and follow our guidelines? And with that, I yield my statement. Thank you.
Appreciate it, gentlemen. You'll back in your last example, you said a few months later in, I think it was October of 2024. I believe you meant October of 2014, just to make sure we have the record clear. That was your last example.
So last example, I quoted two things. The first example was from July 2014, and the following inspection was in August of 2019.
2019, okay. Just making sure we had the timeline right on that. Mr. Claud, your 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is Claud.
Claud.
I hope that's better. Great. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me today. My name is John Claud, and I am a counsel at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara here in Washington, D.C., and we are the nation's largest boutique FDA law firm. I litigated matters for and with FDA for 15 years as a prosecutor at the United States Department of Justice. And I believe in the agency's mission firmly, and I also believe that the people there that I know and worked with very closely are amongst the most dedicated and well-intentioned servants of the American taxpayer. And though I appear today in my personal capacity, and I don't speak for my firm or for my clients, I can tell you that my clients feel the same way. They respect and admire FDA's mission and thrive under its guidelines. Foreign inspections of drug manufacturing facilities are among the many complex areas that FDA regulates, and they present, of course, several challenges for the agency. The subcommittee can doubtlessly imagine how logistical hurdles of recovery from the pandemic, and importantly, the post-pandemic need to ramp up and train qualified inspectors to perform these critical duties impacts the agency's mission. Adding to these complexities, the regulation of the global supply chain impacts several other areas under FDA's ambit, such as drug shortages. I offer that as an example of the reach of the problem that we're talking about today. The agency has some statutory tools to deal with crucial shortages, but it has, on occasion, allowed foreign drugs to supply the market in order to resolve them. No one envies the Hobson's choice that FDA may have to face between allowing a shortage to continue or allowing drugs into the marketplace that may lack a preferred quality pedigree. But this is one example of an area where FDA's quality international assessment issues can lead and have led to domestic problems. Using the tools that we will talk about today, one hopes that FDA can pick some low-hanging fruit as part of its efforts to solve the foreign inspection backlog that affects so many other areas of its mission. Now, the GAO, the HHS, Office of the Inspector General, and FDA itself have all identified the most evident problems. For example, FDA must continue to expand its reliance on international regulatory bodies, a strategy that the agency touts, for example, in its treatment of drug shortages. Data management and utilization is also a key to solving this problem. I would caution, however, that providing FDA with what has been called a mandatory total visibility in the supply chain that is also public raises certain questions about the protection of intellectual property. And it again is an example of the nuances and complexities that face the agency and those of us who are concerned about this issue. That is an idea that requires much discussion. Additionally, FDA has made some inroads into utilizing remote inspection. The agency lags behind other countries in this area. Expanding this program where appropriate might help alleviate some of the foreign backlog that we will discuss today. FDA has programs in place to allow certified and validated third parties to provide inspectional material for regulated companies in the medical device and food space. While those programs are limited and voluntary, similar initiatives might be appropriate here. FDA may be able to measure its success here by aligning some of its metrics, such as an increase in trained staff, the sheer number of inspections, and the subsequent enforcement actions that would inevitably take place. These are vitally important challenges in a global marketplace and some of the many that FDA must fulfill in its mission. And with that, I thank you.
We thank you and now recognize Dr. Denigan-Macauley.
Thank you very much, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's work on FDA's oversight of foreign drug manufacturing. Today, the majority of establishments manufacturing drugs destined for the United States are located overseas. The brand name and generic drugs, as well as those sold over the counter, are made at more than 2,000 facilities here in the United States and nearly 2,800 establishments in countries across the globe. FDA is responsible for overseeing the safety and effectiveness of all drugs marketed in the United States, regardless of where they are produced. A critical element in FDA's oversight of these drugs has been to send investigators on site to inspect these manufacturing facilities. These inspections are crucial in identifying and helping to resolve manufacturing concerns that could jeopardize the safety of drugs our parents, our children, ourselves, and our service members take. Manufacturing problems can have serious consequences. As we've talked about before, we have recently seen with the discovery of bacterial contamination in over-the-counter eye drops, which have led to serious consequences. In work dating back to 1998, we have raised a number of concerns about the effectiveness of FDA's oversight of this increasingly global supply chain, including how few inspections FDA had historically conducted overseas, FDA not knowing how many foreign drug establishments actually needed to be inspected, and persistent workforce challenges. We have also raised concerns about the manner in which FDA conducted its inspections overseas. In 2009, we added FDA's oversight of medical products to what GAO calls our high-risk series, citing the agency's inability to ensure the quality of drugs that are manufactured overseas. I am pleased, however, to report that over the years, FDA has made some progress. FDA now has a better understanding of which drug establishments need to be inspected. The agency also made significant progress increasing the number of overseas inspections, better reflecting where manufacturing is actually occurring. For example, in 2019, FDA conducted most foreign inspections in India and China, the two countries where more than 1/3 of the manufacturing was located. While we applaud this progress, challenges remain. Attracting and retaining an inspection workforce remains a serious concern. FDA has instituted a number of initiatives over the years to boost recruitment and retention, but vacancies persist. FDA has identified these investigator vacancies as one of the reasons it is conducting fewer inspections, particularly so against its peak in 2016. This decline was further complicated, as we know, from COVID-19 pandemic, which caused a dramatic drop in the number of inspections done overseas. During the pandemic, FDA tried to continue its oversight responsibilities in other ways. For example, by relying on inspections conducted by its foreign regulators, requesting and reviewing records from manufacturers, and sampling products at the border. But these efforts could not fully replace an on-site inspection. As a result, FDA faces a backlog. Moreover, we continue to have concerns that inspections conducted overseas still are not equivalent to those in the United States. Specifically, FDA's practice of relying on interpreters provided by the foreign establishment being inspected raises serious concerns about the accuracy of information being gathered. Further, FDA's practice of generally pre-announcing foreign inspections up to 12 weeks in advance gives establishments the opportunity just to fix the problem before an FDA investigator even arrives. As a result, investigators are less likely to see the true day-to-day operating environment as they do here in the United States. After years of voicing our concerns, FDA has initiated pilot programs focused on evaluating the effect of conducting unannounced foreign inspections and using independent translation services. Given our global supply chain, it is critical that FDA provide timely and quality oversight of drug manufacturing to ensure the American people have access to drugs that are safe and effective no matter where they are made. Sustained leadership with attention to this issue and action is needed to ensure that FDA has the right workforce with the right tools to fulfill its responsibilities going forward. Thank you, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the committee for holding this hearing. This concludes my prepared remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your testimony. We'll now move to questioning, and I will begin recognizing myself for 5 minutes of questions. Dr. Denigan-Macauley, workforce. I got 3 questions. I'll give them all to you at one time, but they're pretty simple. What are the educational requirements for an inspector? What is the general range of salary, if you know, for an inspector, overseas foreign inspector? And how many slots are currently unfilled? And again, I recognize you may not have the exact number, but if you can give me rough estimates.
Sure. We do have ongoing work where I can give you exact numbers, but I can give you a ballpark. So I don't have the exact salary information in front of me. I'd be happy to get that to you, but we do know
But
that.
it's more than 25,000.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it was on the GS schedule. I believe it was at a 12, and they're now saying that they want to hire inspectors at a higher level.
And what would a 12 for the folks back home? What would a 12 be, roughly?
I honestly don't know.
All right, fair enough.
I'd have to
Okay.
to look at it. So they are looking at trying to increase salaries. They're trying to provide incentives.
Because they're not able to recruit people.
Correct.
And how many slots, do you have any idea how many slots are open? Are we talking about 5 or are we talking about
So
25?
there's 3 different groups of recruiters. There's the base here in America, and they have openings that were there. The last time we reported, I believe, I'm afraid to give the wrong answer, but overseas, it's significant. I mean,
Okay.
only having 1 out of 8 is a significant problem. And in India, they had 1 position that was still available there, but they only had 5 inspectors. So you're talking it's a significant portion when
Okay.
you don't have.
So, Mr. Claude, in your testimony, and several others have mentioned it, talking about the remote or the Zoom inspections. And while I'm not totally against those, I'm all for telemedicine. Here's my concern. Although I applaud these kinds of creative ideas, my concern is you can't see in the Zoom the rats skittering across the floor. And they're not likely to show you the documents in the bin that are being destroyed with acid, because you're not likely to say, show us the acid bin or the acid barrel in the back part of the facility. So as I was discussing this before the hearing with a reporter, David Lim of Politico, and he did what reporters do, he just listened. But I was formulating a concept that I've had. It would seem to me that with the amount of money that we have allocated already, that perhaps what we need are preliminary inspectors. And so I'm going to throw this creative idea out here, because I'm not here to bash the FDA. I'm here to say we got a problem, let's try to fix it. So I'm going to throw this idea and see what you think of it, and you all can respond. That we have these preliminary inspectors, that what we do is we hire people that don't have that educational level that would be required for a full inspector. We're not going to get into the chemistry. I think one of you mentioned that. But just to see, as I think it was one of you all's reports from 2019, where when they did an inspection of a facility in China, they found feces all over the bathroom walls. I mean, that bathroom hadn't been cleaned in years. It doesn't take a highly educated individual. I mean, maybe you want to have a college degree, a couple of weeks of training. We're looking for cleanliness here, people, to do a preliminary inspection and then give to the other inspectors who were there that know how to look at the chemistry and make sure that the batches are right, the ability to have some insight before they go there, and then to give the FDA the tool. These are the ones in the worst shape from a cleanliness standpoint, which are most likely to have a negative process going on the line too. If they can't even keep the floors in the bathrooms clean, they're more likely to have problems on the line. Mr. Claude, what do you say?
I think that has some promise, and I think that the idea of how we use tele-inspections and digital inspections matters a great deal.
And preliminary inspectors, as I just pointed out. Let me just get a yes or no, because I'm running out of time from the other two. Do you all think that's an idea that would work?
Chairman Griffith, I think that, in 2014, I would have said yes. I think the companies have gotten smarter. I think that they've figured out better ways of trying to evade inspections. So if you don't have somebody who's forensically trained to look for fraud, you're not going to be able to find it.
Well, and I'm not even looking for the fraud at this point. I'm just looking for cleanliness to make sure we don't have feces in our medications. Ms. Denigan-Macauley?
So we have asked for them to look at the remote tools that they have to see if maybe they could combine. You could
Okay.
have an inspector there and you could use a remote tool.
All right. I've been advised that the salary is about 120. Mr. Claude, I want to ask you, your experience with New England Compounding Center disaster and the lack of FDA being proactive in that, do you think that we could have a similar type of situation happening with foreign drugs if we don't fix this system? And I want to be a partner. I'm not beating up on the FDA. Do you agree with me that that could be a problem?
Of course, that risk always exists, especially with the kinds of drugs, sterile injectable drugs, that are of the highest risk where there is no functioning immune system in the human body.
Yeah, I appreciate it. My time is up. I yield back and now recognize Ms. Castor for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. FDA has implemented some new initiatives across food and drug safety. And you said they're making some progress. One of the things that Congress did, we appropriated an additional $10 million to FDA for the pilot program for unannounced inspections. So I'd like your view, Dr. Denigan-Macauley. What do we know about the status of this? How is it working? And what are the characteristics of a successful unannounced inspection initiative?
Yeah, so they started the pilot over in India. They did phase 1. They've actually completed phase 1 of the pilot. And what that was going in with unannounced inspections. And they're getting ready to do a phase 1 over in China. My understanding is they have not yet started the phase 1 there. We have ongoing work that will continue to look at that. We have had longstanding concerns about the unannounced inspections and also the translation program as well, and ensuring that they get the pilot. The reason they canceled the last inspection or pilot program that they had, they didn't want to call it a pilot, was because it didn't have enough of the values in there to look at the criteria to see if it was working effectively. So GAO made a recommendation that they have to ensure that the pilot program fits the criteria that GAO put forward, and that you can evaluate whether it's effective or not, because this has been going on for years.
Does that mean that they have full access to the product, that they're able to test it? Give us a little more detail on what a successful unannounced inspection means.
So they have to come up with, and I know it's going to sound very GAO-ish, but they have to come up with measures. If you're comparing it against the unannounced versus the announced, and they're trying to look at the impacts on public health and whether or not it's making a difference, and they're also looking at cost benefits, then they have to come up with a way to measure that, and that's extremely difficult to do. And so we've asked them that you have to plan that out, because that's why they canceled the last one. They said they didn't have those measures. And this time, we want the pilot to be done so that we can make a determination.
And is this pilot hamstrung as well by the lack of workforce and staffing, or is that proceeding?
The pilot, because it involves actual inspections, they can only do as many as the workforce will allow, rather than being able to do inspections based on the number that they actually want to do.
Okay. Right, none of this is possible without adequate resources from the Congress. Mr. Thakur, you have some recommendations in your testimony. One is mandatory end-user testing, a mandatory testing program for all drugs entering the U.S. from countries where past inspections have demonstrated a consistent pattern of fraud and GMP violations. Tell us a little bit about that, and what kind of cost estimates are there to do something like that?
So the Department of Defense is actually funding a pilot right now that is evaluating a small subsection of what we call high-risk drugs. And by April, we should know whether, what the pilot actually yields. The Uniformed Service University, along with Valashore, they are conducting a small pilot at the moment, and we will see. For a long period of time, I think that, the medical community and the patient community has always accepted that once the US FDA grants marketing authorization for a generic, they are interchangeably prescribed. You go to CVS and you get your prescription filled, and you go, if you go to Walgreens, you expect to get similar drug. The same drug the doctor prescribed to you. Well, we know that there is batch-to-batch variability. That has been conclusively established so far. The question here is, we don't know how big the problem is. And so, without independent assessment of the FDA's ability to test, to conduct inspections, we really cannot answer that question. Hopefully, by April, once the DoD pilot concludes, we will have better answers to say, is this a problem that is insurmountable? Is it a problem that we can solve within a year with additional resources? Or do we have to think differently about the way that we think about drug quality? I just do not know the answer to the question right now.
Mr. Claud, are you familiar with this DoD study, and what do you think about implementing a mandatory testing program for all drugs entering the United States from countries where past inspections have demonstrated a pattern of problem?
Well, I'm not intimately familiar with the DoD program. I've never worked at the Department of Defense, so I don't have that insight. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is set up so that FDA must rely on the voluntary compliance of industry, right? And that is part of the clunkiness of enforcing it, is because it is written from the standpoint of drug manufacturers voluntarily complying because of course, the problem that FDA can never get to every facility. So testing every drug that comes in, testing all of it, that seems to me to be a logistical problem, to say the least. And I think there probably are other tools that are available
But I think
to
what
reduce
he's saying
risk.
is, if there is a pattern, if there's a pattern of issues in the past, that you would prioritize those inspections.
Go ahead.
No, so what I was saying was, we know that sterile injectables are the highest risk category. They're on shortage. We know that there are problems with contamination. So at least
I'm
start
sorry,
with
I'm
that.
over. I
Sorry.
apologize. We'll submit, we'll ask you to go into greater depth in the record. Thank you. I yield back.
One of the problems all members face with only having 5 minutes, I now recognize Ms. Rogers, the chairwoman of the full committee, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A report issued yesterday by the Coalition for a Prosperous America, CPA, found that most APIs used for generics are, well, they said nearly wholly reliant on China. And without objection, I'd like this report to be entered into the record.
Madam Chair, we'll take that up at the end when we do all the list of items. You all have seen this? Thank
So
you.
the report, some manufacturers get over half of their API from China. Some of those API suppliers have ties to China's military, questionable safety records, and rely on forced labor. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. The findings in this report are extremely concerning. Dr. Denigan-Macauley, does FDI regularly conduct timely follow-up visits to plants in China where raw materials come from, especially those that it finds deficient or unsafe? And how far down the chain do the FDA inspectors go?
Well, as we had talked about with workforce issues, it's challenging for FDA to do the inspections and the follow-ups that it wants to do. If they do find a problem, they do follow up, but they don't necessarily go back and do an inspection each time. So they look at documents that they receive, they look at the actions that the agency has taken, and in fact, in many cases, the response can actually be resolved just through written correspondence.
Okay, thank you. Have you looked at how many employees have come back to work to FDA following COVID? I don't have that number right in front of me, but I know that it's been very slow and it's been extremely difficult even to get return phone calls from FDA employees, current employees, let alone talking about more employees.
If you're referring to going from a telework to an in-person, I do not have that information. It's not something we're looking at. I know GEO has looked at telework, so I can look to see if we've done work in that area.
Okay, thank you. Do FDA inspectors highlight potential national security risks they discover, such as a plant being heavily dependent on China suppliers? Do they take any observations about working conditions and human rights, or are they solely focused on quality and safety concerns?
The job is to go and look at quality and safety concerns.
Okay, thank you. Is it realistic for us to expect the Chinese government and CCP to allow the FDA to conduct widespread, unannounced inspections of Chinese drug manufacturers?
They have to have access to be able to determine if it's being produced with the good manufacturing practices. Whether or not that's in person, I can't answer that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Claud, in your testimony, you described how FDA devalued a U.S.-based generic drug manufacturer, using a drug shortage in favor of a generic drug manufactured by a now bankrupt Chinese company that had previously received FDA warning letters for failure to follow safe manufacturing practices. You call this ironic and unfair, given that the U.S. company followed FDA's policies and invested in safe facilities. I agree. The FDA is supposed to have one gold standard for all drug manufacturers, but it seems to me the FDA's foreign inspectors program and its tactics for manufacturing shortages create a double standard that increases our reliance on foreign drug manufacturers, especially those in China. Mr. Claud, can you elaborate on some of the disparities between FDA's oversight of foreign manufacturers compared to those in the U.S.?
Well, you highlighted how this impacts the generic drug industry, which is such an important part of how we receive health care in the United States. Mm-hmm. And the generic drug industry wants a level playing field, right? It wants the same standards applied to it as here domestically as FDA applies to anyone else. And when you have a situation like the one I referenced in my written statement, where a generic drug manufacturer got an approval, has invested heavily in quality so as to provide a safe haven for the kinds of drugs that are at issue, that's a place where FDA can lean. That is a place that FDA can lean on to help resolve some of these problems. And if FDA doesn't do that, it contributes to things like shortages, and it contributes to things like this disparate treatment that we're talking about.
Thank you. Mr. Thakur, I appreciate you being here today and bringing the unique perspective of a whistleblower. You're worried that little has changed in 18 years. What should we be doing?
I think that this DoD pilot will actually give us more data to try and assess how true is that once a marketing authorization is granted to a generic, that all generics are interchangeable. We just do not have that. We accept that as gospel at the moment.
Okay.
And I think that information will be really useful for the
Thank
Congress
you.
to be able to make decisions.
Thank you all for being here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. FDA sets a high bar for food and drug safety, and the agency needs to have the right tools to maintain its high safety standards and prevent Americans from being harmed by contaminated products. For the past several months, Democrats have been fighting for FDA to have greater visibility into the global drug market. In its latest report, GAO explained how having greater visibility into the supply chain could sharpen FDA's foreign drug inspections infrastructure. And GAO wrote that because FDA may not be aware of foreign manufacturers' key ingredients, that important facilities may end up excluding from FDA's foreign inspections. So, Dr. Denigan-Macauley, if FDA had more visibility into the drug supply chain, what actions would FDA be able to take to strengthen its foreign drug inspection program, if you will?
Yeah, so the concern is that the data that they're getting, even through the new authorities, through the CARES Act, it's not timely enough. In order to help address some of the drug shortages that Mr. Claud was referring to, we need timely information. And so they would like for that information to be more timely. They also need to know the source of the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, because the way it's currently worded is, the way it's currently worded is they may include that source, but not that they have to include that source. So getting more specific information, having more complete information will allow FDA to take action to inspect a facility, for example, if they do have concerns.
Now, the COVID pandemic required FDA to use alternative tools such as remote record requests and more extensive product sampling to ensure a safe food and drug supply at a time when foreign travel was severely limited. For example, FDA's use of product sampling during the pandemic resulted in the agency placing 54 establishments on import alert between March and December 2020. So again, Doctor, why is it important for Congress to provide FDA with flexible tools to promote regulatory compliance, particularly during a public health emergency?
Those additional tools are of extreme value. They not only need boots on the ground, but then they have to, because of the workforce issues that they have, they can't be in every plant. There's just too many of them. As I had mentioned in my opening, there are thousands. So having these additional tools would help them to provide the oversight that they need. And I believe, as Ms. Castor had said, it would put pressure knowing that FDA is out there.
Now, I've, of course, mentioned FDA's limited resources, which I think should be expanded, and the complexity of the global food and drug supply chain. But, even with more resources, they'd still have to prioritize the resources, right? So let me ask Mr. Claud, while remote inspections are not appropriate in every case and cannot fully replace in-person inspections, how could the agency better use remote inspection capabilities to help prioritize its inspections and focus on the most urgent safety threats to the drug supply?
Thank you, Congressman. FDA takes enforcement actions on a risk-based system, and that means you have to evaluate what the risk is presented by a certain facility, say. Remote inspections, for example, one way we could use them more effectively is to contribute to that risk assessment, so that if a remote inspection, an interview, forgive me that I'm speaking as a former prosecutor, these people are trained to know what good evidence and bad evidence is, right? They know something they know a red flag when they see it, or at least they should if they're trained properly. Use remote inspections to try to to determine where the red flags are. And if a facility doesn't present any red flags, devote those resources elsewhere.
All right. Well, I think it's clear that we have bipartisan agreement, if you will, that Americans are entitled to the highest standard of food and drug safety. And I just hope that we can work together across the aisle to grant FDA the tools it needs and the resources it needs to address public health threats from a global market. So thank you, thank the witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. So, Dr. Denigan-Macauley, you talked about the differences in announced and unannounced visits and how unannounced are more or better, because obviously you don't have time for people to hide evidence if they're moving forward. You know, it kind of frustrates me in this whole hearing, maybe what Mr. Thakur's talked about as well, is that it just seems there are actors out there, if we're not inspecting them and catching them, they're not going to do what's right. And hopefully you have people doing what's right and you're only verifying they're doing what's right, because what happens then is either you get a recall or you have a problem when you go inspect, and we have the shortages that we're having, and, you know, people are not getting their cancer treatments moving forward. So we'd certainly like to have in our foreign, in our domestic everywhere, the spirit of doing things the right way, so we can make sure we get the right thing. But so so my question is on just even doing an announced inspection, and maybe Mr. Claud, you could talk on this too, in a foreign country. Are there things that beholden to the country that prevent you from doing unannounced inspections? For instance, if you have to get a certification or requirement, or can you guarantee that you're going to get a surprise inspection, or is the fact that you're being tracked by the country or whatever tip off the facility that an unannounced inspection is coming, therefore making it announced?
Yeah, so it is difficult to do, and FDA has given us a long list of reasons why they need to announce it. I mean, they have to get visas. If you're taking an investigator from here in the United States, the announcement's quite clear. I mean, it's word of mouth. We've been in India, we've been in China, we've been on the ground. The WhatsApp does work. You know, communication gets out there, and if you're having the company assist with accommodations, travel arrangements, I mean, they know you're coming well in advance. And so what they're trying to do is, if they can use the State Department, for example, but you still have to get visas. And that's why the boots on the ground in country is so important. They're the ones that can get the unannounced inspections done.
Okay. Mr. Claude, do you have any comments on that?
Just that FDA does have tools to put a stop to, in the case where someone finds out that an inspector is coming, denies entry, or somehow prohibits or obstructs FDA. You know, these are registered facilities with FDA, they should be, and FDA has the power of an import alert to stop their importation into the country. And that's a tool, that's a hammer that could, sort of Damocles, that could dangle over the heads of these places to permit more access. Now, what I can't speak to is the exact data as to how frequently FDA has wielded that power over the regulated industry or not, but just so the subcommittee understands, FDA does have some tools, again, at its disposal right now that it can use, but Dr. Denigan-Macauley makes a really good point. It's hard to sneak up on people when you're flying from, you know, White Oak, Maryland to, you know, Hyderabad.
Right. Exactly. So I'm going to change a little bit, Mr. Claude. This is for you. So China's counter-espionage law, how does that undermine our pharmaceutical supply chain and our national security? And, for example, does FDA have a seat at the table with the U.S. national security apparatus to ensure this Chinese law won't undermine our pharmaceutical supply chains?
Well, so, Congressman, I think you can come at this from a couple of different perspectives. You can look at this from FDA needs more resources. You can also look at this from a perspective of reliance on Chinese pharmaceuticals generally, and these numbers are elusive, depends on what article you read and when, from what time, but the imports of pharmaceuticals from China certainly are increasing. I think that generally presents a national security question that bears discussing. I am not a national security expert, so will you allow me to not try to wax intelligent about a law that I'm not especially familiar with?
Okay. Would you wax intelligent about this one then? I got another question for you, and anyone who wants to answer it, but I'll direct it to you first. Actually, my good friend Ms. Castor asked you the question on Department of Defense. So the question is, having two agencies trying to do inspections and regulate this, does that cause a problem? I mean, what are the issues with the two agencies doing it? You want?
May I defer to
Sure.
Dr. Thakur?
Let me actually answer the first question that you asked, because I have some data here. This is HHS list of essential medicines. This basically tells us this is national importance for us. 50 of the 120 from the 2020 list are manufactured in Asia today. 70 of the 120 have raw material and ingredients coming from Asia today. If that is not a national security issue, I don't know what is.
Absolutely.
And so the question you're asking is that, would two agencies try and coordinate among themselves? My answer is, I think that the training that the FDA inspectors are given in order to look for the kind of information, because when we go and do inspections, we are bound by our Code of Federal Regulations, which is CFR 211. And we're also bound by a product that we actually sell in the United States. For example, one of the things that we talked about is mutually recognizable recognition procedures among foreign inspection agencies like MHRA and the European Union. When inspectors go to inspect a facility, they inspect a product that is made for their market. And not every strength and every formulation that is sold in the United States is sold in Europe. So on what grounds are they going to inspect a product that is made for the United States, even if you're relying on a mutually recognizable procedure with a foreign inspection facility? So there are challenges in here. We cannot, sort of blanketly expect that an MHRA inspection or a European inspection will actually provide us information that we need.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired, and I'll yield back. And the chair recognizes Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to try and get Ms. Denigan-Macauley. I wanted to ask my questions of you and comments. I know that you had in your testimony the link between the decline of the foreign drug inspections, pretty much due to the fact that there was really a shortage of the investigators. Instead of helping, I'm sorry to say, the Republicans made a decision instead to this problem to actually cut funding for this program, funding to the extent that it could even lower by about 35% the number of inspectors that we could have. That's unfortunate, and I hope that doesn't come to fruition. That's in this budget year. What I wanted to ask of you, though, is I know that the reduction of these foreign and domestic inspectors has been a real problem. And I am just wondering what the GAO recommended more staff. And I'm wondering at this point, what has happened with this recommendation? Are we seeing more people that are available?
Yes, so at the time of our last report, which I think is what you're referring to, they do have some serious workforce gaps. So for example, they have the different categories of workforce. They have the domestic-based inspectors where there's gaps. The foreign cadre had, I believe, 8 of 20 vacancies. I mean, that's pretty significant when you're looking at only 20 dedicated staff, and in the foreign offices, almost 50% were vacant as well. And so we had asked that they come up with dedicated strategies to figure out how they can recruit. And the other problem is retaining, because even if they get them on board, they finally get them geared up to be able to do the inspection overseas, then they leave because the experience that they have is useful in either other parts of the agency we've talked about where they can get pulled from, or they can actually get pulled to other into the private sector. And so we do keep our eyes on this recommendation. We've been told that FDA has developed some strategies, and that is part of our current ongoing work to see if it's going to be sufficient.
Is it as bad for the domestic as well as the foreign, or where's the recruitment?
The foreign is
challenge?
definitely your major stress point because of the challenges of doing these. These inspections are often done alone overseas in a foreign country, which you can imagine in China and India would be challenging.
Yeah, I do understand that. I also wanted to just raise the question of medical device recalls and the limited ability right now of the FDA to do extensive research recalls. And I know that in 2020, the FDA recorded over 3 million potential problems and about with invalid products, and 330 of those, 1,000 of those were injuries or death. And so what can we do about that? And there's a difference, is there not, in the recall procedures for healthcare, for food, for drugs, and for medical devices. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, the recall options for the FDA.
Okay. So we do have ongoing work that's looking at FDA's implementation of what we call an active surveillance system. Right now, devices are based on a passive surveillance system, which means it's too late. The problem's already occurred. It's being reported from a hospital, for example, if there's a death from an implant of the device. So we are looking at that. That is a long-standing Congress mandated that they implement this, and we're looking at the challenges that they're experiencing and why it's not up and running. We also have work that we're going to soon begin that's going to actually look at devices, that's going to look at the number of recalls, what the characteristics are, whether or not FDA's been timely in being able to get those recall adverse reports as well. You're absolutely correct. The recall authorities are not consistent across the board. We don't have it necessarily for the drugs that we're talking about today. We do have it for cosmetics and food. So there are differences within the agency with respect to our recall authority.
We should look into that, whether that's the most equitable way to do that, but thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and now recognize Mr. Palmer for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Denigan-Macauley, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the FDA faced a backlog of inspections resulting in some foreign facilities not being inspected in more than 5 years. When I saw that, the first thing that came to mind was what happened at the Abbott facility in Michigan with the baby formula. And you also mentioned that in the GAO's 22 report that it was reported that the FDA routinely inspects domestic facilities unannounced, but generally pre-announces the inspection of foreign facilities. They did the same thing at the Abbott facility, and that didn't work out so well. So it raises serious concerns for me that if the FDA is not inspecting these foreign facilities in a timely manner and they're pre-announcing it, I'm not sure we're going to get an accurate result from those inspections. How would you respond to that?
I would respond that we agree. We voiced concerns for decades about the fact that they're pre-announcing inspections. In order to get an accurate assessment of the current status of a plant, and in order to be equivalent to what we're doing here in the United States now, they were pre-announcing inspections during COVID, but now during normal times, peace times, they do not pre-announce the United States.
But that creates an unlevel playing field for domestic versus foreign.
Correct.
I'm glad that they're going back to unannounced inspections. I think that ought to be the case with the foreign facilities as well. Mr. Thakur, I see you're an engineer by training. I like engineers. I worked for 2 international engineering companies. I often say that engineers are people who are good at math but don't have enough personality to be an accountant. No disrespect to accountants. But in your written testimony, you said it's high time to accept the fact that the American regulatory approach, which is largely an honors-based system toward foreign pharmaceutical facilities, is a very different, which have very different corporate cultures. Right. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. So the way that Mr. Claud also talked about this, which is that the way that we conduct inspections is basically a document-based inspection. So we ask the manufacturer to provide evidence that they've done things the right way, followed our regulations, and we just check the documents. That's the way that we've always, sort of ensured quality. What is happening right now is basically we are conducting a pilot to independently verify whether that's actually true. The fact that the checking documents actually allows us to be able to ensure that the quality of what is dispensed when I go get my prescription filled at CVS or Walgreens, is that interchangeable with, doesn't matter who makes it. And I think that that's an open question at the moment, because for the longest period of time, we've always accepted that this is the way things work.
You also mentioned, though, the possibility of criminal prosecution as a deterrent.
I do. And I've in my opening statement, I actually provide examples where for 10 years, if we continue to see the same kind of behavior, fraudulent behavior, then I think that, that we need to provide the FDA with better tools to be able to sort of hold individuals accountable.
Well, that leads me to Mr. Claud and your company, Nexus Pharmaceuticals, and you say that all you're asking for is a level playing field.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, Congressman.
So, but what you mean by that is that the cost of your product is increased by the regulatory regime in this country versus what it might be in a foreign country, or expand on that a little bit.
Well, I think what Nexus Pharmaceuticals and other generic makers face is that the margins in that industry are very low. And when a company invests in quality and a company invests in approvals, as FDA wants it to do so, it should not then face off against uninspected or higher risk, right? We talk about this higher risk assessment that FDA has to make, higher risk competition from foreign manufacturers, and part of that is a duty to ensure that the foreign API that a generic maker is using, it meets a standard, and companies that do that should be tent poles for FDA to appreciate and lean on to solve some of these problems.
Well, I don't know that Ms. Denigan-Macauley has time to fully answer this, but it's been announced that there's a reorganization going on, and one of the problems with the FDA is the food inspection, the drug inspection was separate, and not, you didn't have the organizational structure, and we found that out during the Abbott investigation. But you are going through a reorganization, and I'd like to know more about that. Maybe you can respond in writing rather than in the hearing, since I have gone over my time. But thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, appreciate it. And as everybody on the committee knows, you have the right to ask questions after the hearing is over. I recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank you and the ranking member for hosting this hearing. As a ranking member on the Subcommittee on Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Materials, I am deeply concerned by the potential for toxic contaminants in our supply of food and supply of drugs. Manufacturers play a critically important role in FDA's regulatory scheme. However, FDA still lacks key authorities to impose testing requirements on manufacturers of important products. For example, under current law, manufacturers are not required to test ingredients or final products marketed for consumption by infants and young children for lead and other toxic elements. FDA has requested authority to require such testing and access to test results whenever necessary. While sampling and testing are not a complete substitute for inspections, product testing by manufacturers is critically important for our supply of drugs. So, Dr. Denigan-Macauley, what role does FDA's drug testing requirement play in making certain that foreign drugs are free from contamination and other defects?
Yeah, so we reported that they have done sampling at the boarding, and they've done testing at the border, and testing. They've increased the use of that particular, what we call an alternative tool during the COVID-19 pandemic, because they weren't able to be boots on the ground overseas to be able to do the inspections, and they were able to take action. For example, they have import alerts, they can do warning letters in response to the sampling. But we have asked them, that it's a good question, and we've asked them to look at tools such as sampling and how it can enhance their oversight and what role it should play going forward, because they certainly used it more during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And how do these testing and sampling requirements supplement the important work of on-site inspections?
It's just what you said. It's a supplement. Any additional information they can get, because imagine one inspector is located overseas, and some of these plants or establishments are huge, and so they can't necessarily get everything. So if there are some red warning flags, they can certainly sample, they can do additional document requests. So it's an additional tool in their toolbox.
GAO has reported that while COVID-19 restricted the FDA's ability to conduct in-person foreign inspections, FDA made extensive use of testing and sample collection. So FDA sampling during the pandemic resulted in 54 of the 64 import alerts that the agency instituted between March 1st of 2020 and December 1st of that same year. Dr. Denigan-Macauley, again, how was FDA able to make certain that effective use of its own sampling and testing infrastructure was being conducted during the pandemic?
Well, and again, that's part of the recommendation that we have, that they need to come up with a way to assess the tools, the sampling, to ensure that it is being used to its maximum capacity and to best supplement, for example, the on-site inspections.
So moving forward, how can FDA make better use of the information it gathers from tests and samples, both its own samples and those from manufacturers, to inform its foreign inspections work?
So the best use is to have that information go into his risk-based model that Mr. Claud has referred to. They don't have the resources to inspect everything. So every additional piece of information that they can get to identify the bad actors is best use of resources.
So I'm hearing that kind of repeated today, having the resources at the agency in order to do the work thoroughly and effectively. So with that, I appreciate your responses, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. He yields back. Now recognize Dr. Dunn for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to wave on to this important hearing. Oversight of the FDA's inspection function is a much-needed requirement for informed conversation and policy considerations related to nearshoring and friendshoring pharmaceutical manufacture. Our generic drug supply is particularly vulnerable to bad actors such as the Chinese Communist Party, due to their worldwide dominance of the production of active pharmaceutical ingredients, API. The Select Committee on China, on which I sit, released an economic report at the end of last year which details the vulnerabilities of our generic drug supply chains as they relate to API production and malign actors. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this report into the, record.
And we'll put that on our list at the end of the hearing.
Thank you very much. The United States and the rest of the world is completely reliant on Chinese manufacturing to meet our generic drug needs due to their dominance in API. India, the second largest supplier of pharmaceuticals to the U.S., also sources 70% of its API from China. Unreliable inspection practices leave us vulnerable to the risk of tainted medications, and the lack of accountability to meet FDA standards demonstrates a weakness that bad actors are quick to take advantage of. API supply challenges were highlighted in a concerning report released by the Coalition for a Prosperous America regarding Aurobindo Pharmaceuticals, the #1 supplier for generic pharmaceutical prescriptions to the U.S. We'll enter that report into the record as well at the end.
Likewise, we'll have to show it to our colleagues on the other side, but we'll add it to our list at the end of the hearing.
Thank you very much. Aurobindo Pharma has been plagued with corruption, quality control violations, sanctions by the EU, recalls in the U.S., the list goes on and on. The report found that this Indian company relies on several Chinese suppliers with ties to the PRC or with stakeholders there, subsidiaries and business partners that have been sanctioned by the United States. Mr. Thakur, I commend the actions you took as a whistleblower to reveal the shortcomings of the FDA inspection program. You described your concern with the ability of the FDA to implement the GAO's recommendations for improving the inspection programs. Your recommendation to mirror a cooperative research and development agreement, a CRADA, like the Department of Defense is pursuing for independent drug quality, is very interesting to me, and I've had the opportunity to visit with an independent lab that they are working with. I agree that requiring independent validation of safety and efficacy of products sold in the U.S. should be considered. You mentioned requiring the purchaser, such as a PBM, to conduct such testing. It may be hard to implement that mandate. I don't know. How do you think Congress could otherwise incentivize bulk purchasers of generic drugs to implement end-user testing?
One of the outcomes that we're looking at, the DoD pilot program, is a scale, a red, green, blue kind of a thing that basically says the confidence in the quality of batch-to-batch variability among the products. If patients are empowered with that kind of information, I think that they'll demand that. I think the industry will then respond to it. I think that, you're absolutely right. You can't enforce, a private company to be able to do that kind of testing, but the confidence among the patient prescribers and the patients at the time of dispensing goes up. And they have the ability to say that, I have more confidence in our ability to this particular product that's made at a facility that's been inspected by the FDA over a period of time with good.
I agree with you, and I appreciate that. I certainly looked for that information when buying drugs for my clinic when I was in practice. Ms. Denigan-Macauley, Aurobindo's non-compliance with the FDA's regulations are well documented. The company leads Indian manufacturers in recalls in this country. And the Coalition for Prosperous America report documents those close ties to the CCP. Does the FDA have any process in place to determine whether foreign drug manufacturers exporting products to the United States have ties to companies sanctioned by the U.S.?
So they certainly have some information. They have to get information about where the API may come from, but it's not definitively where it comes from. And so they don't have the complete information, and GAO has said that they need to either get the complete information. If they don't have those authorities, just talk to Congress and seek those authorities.
Well, we're running out of time, so I can't go into my other questions and examples. But, I think that this goes to the problem that we need to have testing, sampling and testing, and accurate insights, the quality of these medications. Mr. Chairman, thank you again.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I first owe Dr. Ruiz an apology. I got the order mixed up, and I do apologize for that. But now I recognize Dr. Ruiz for his 5 minutes of questioning.
So, Mr. Chairman, that means you owe me?
I do owe you, yes.
So that means next time when there's somebody before me, you're going to you put me in front of them.
If I can figure out how to do that openly, yes.
When I'm running late, that's when you figure out how to do that.
There you go.
You got to accommodate my time. I appreciate that apology. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More than 2/3 of the facilities manufacturing active pharmaceutical ingredients for drugs sold in the United States are located overseas. This is truly a global market, so it's critical that the FDA has visibility into manufacturing facilities around the world. We know that FDA has both proactive and reactive tools at its disposal to address drug and food safety issues. And over the past year, for example, we've seen FDA step in and coordinate national responses when it received reports of potentially contaminated products. While reactive activities like product alerts and recall are important, FDA also needs the tools to prevent unsafe products from reaching consumers in the first place. Dr. Denigan-Macauley, how does a robust foreign inspection program help FDA prevent outbreaks before they happen so that it doesn't have to take reactive efforts when outbreaks occur?
Yeah, so it's absolutely imperative that FDA can get to the problem before it occurs. After the fact, it's just too late. So the prevention is key, and so that's what we've been talking about with those inspections. FDA considers the inspection the most important tool that they have in their toolbox in order to prevent, because they can see it with their naked eye. We've gone through with them through facilities, and we've seen how difficult and challenging that job is. But also document sampling, access to document requests can also be of assistance.
As part of the public health infrastructure, FDA has an important role to play during public health emergencies. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, FDA considered inspections in support of emergency use authorizations for pandemic-related countermeasures to be priorities. Dr. Denigan-Macauley, how should FDA be approaching its foreign inspections program as part of its broader pandemic preparedness responsibilities?
It's a big question. So there was a lot of concern with respect to the emergency use authorization, because you could be bringing in medicines, you could be bringing in drugs that have not had an inspection, but because of the nature of the pandemic, we had to get them here to help with our response. So being able to think broadly and lessons learned is a big message that GAO has been putting out about how to do that better and more effectively going forward for the next pandemic.
Could you send that report? Is that report done?
So this is our body collectively of work is saying that lessons learned are very important, and so it's in that theory, that thinking, that's what's important to do. It's not one report; it's collectively the thinking.
Well, I'd like to see if there's anything in right. I am,
sure,
after all, the ranking member of the Select
Absolutely.
Subcommittee on COVID pandemic, and it's exactly what my intent is to collect the lessons learned so we can give recommendations for preventing future pandemics and better preparing for future pandemics in order to save lives. So the GAO included protecting public health through enhanced oversight of medical products as a high-risk list item. What has GAO recommended to FDA to make additional progress on this high-risk area? And what has FDA done to address those recommendations?
So we meet biannually with HHS to go over this important issue. They are taking it very seriously. They understand that leadership commitment is absolutely imperative, so they have brought leadership into the conversation. We're not working in stovepipes just with FDA or just with ASPR, for example. So that's one of the first steps. We need them to think broadly and strategically about this. We need to make sure that they have the right workforce with the right capacity. During the pandemic, DOD was brought in, DHS was brought in. I mean, you saw a lot of responsibilities that have now been put on HHS alone. And so we are working with them, and it's not something, they're not going to be able to resolve this overnight. It's going to take time.
Okay, I appreciate it, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I have to thank you for having this hearing and also the ranking member. This subcommittee has a long history of oversight on the issue under both Democratic and Republican leadership, and I was really happy you were here having the hearing. Unfortunately, like everybody else, I'm toggling back and forth with the energy hearing on which I'm the ranking member. So I want to thank the witnesses for coming. In 2019, when I was chair of this subcommittee, we had a hearing on foreign drug inspections, and in 2022, we had a bipartisan hearing in response to the contamination of infant formula. And I mean, it sounds like there's been some progress in reading the reports for this hearing, but also, as I think my colleagues have mentioned, there have been persistent concerns that we need to continue to address. As noted in the GAO's 2022 report on FDA's foreign inspections, as of November 2021, 8 of the 20 positions were vacant in the FDA's cadre of drug investigators that conduct only foreign inspections, and 5 of 15 positions were vacant in its foreign offices in China and India. So Dr. Denigan-Macauley, following your report, have the vacancies rates improved?
So that's the subject of our current work. We do know that the pandemic has had a pretty devastating effect on the workforce. So I'm not in a position to say if it's improved.
Well, have the vacancies been filled?
No.
Thank you. Now, also you reported that FDA has attributed longstanding vacancy patterns to the hardships associated with conducting foreign inspections. We've been talking about that over the years, too. So could investigators who are not in the foreign cadre be detailed to foreign inspections on a temporary basis rather than to having to permanently have this arduous schedule?
Yes, that's in fact one of the strategies that FDA says that they're working on, is to come up with a detail so they can see what it's like, get a feel for it.
Yeah, I mean that would, because this really arduous permanent schedule of travel, I think, is what has hurt us in our ability to fill these positions. So doing temporary assignments might really help. Now, I recognize that the funding for inspectors comes both from appropriated funds and user fees. We hope that we're beginning to consider fiscal year 2025 appropriations, and we have the ability to do this ourselves without any additional authorizing legislation. And so, Dr. Denigan-Macauley, I want to ask you, does FDA have the consistent and predictable funding today it needs to hire enough investigators to fulfill its mission?
So again, that is part of our ongoing work. I know that they have used the user fees, and they've been able to accomplish a significant number of inspections through the inspectors hired with the user fees.
So I'm glad that's part of your work, but my question is the funding consistent and predictable enough to be able to achieve the purpose?
I don't have an answer to that, but I do have an answer in that they are inspecting based on the workforce that they have, rather than coming up with what they need to do and then identifying the workforce for what they need to do, if that makes sense. They're inspecting based on the workforce that they have.
Right, I understand that. That's part of the problem that
Correct.
we've got. They don't have enough workforce. It's like a
Right.
catch-22. So what do you think some of the immediate steps are that FDA can take to address the backlog of inspections due to COVID-19?
So importantly, they are addressing our recommendation about that. They have come up with a plan. They're coming up with a plan to address the backlog. The problem, though, is that it puts other things on hold. When you don't have the workforce to be able to do what you normally would do, and then you have to redirect resources. But those companies, in some cases, have been waiting for that inspection.
When do you think that plan will be complete?
I don't have that at my fingertips. I believe this year that FDA has already provided us information. We're in the process of reviewing that, and we should have an answer by May
By May, okay, we'll look forward
on the
to-
status of where that plan stands.
Okay. Let me just say that I know I parachuted in here today, but, Mr. Chairman, this is not, this is exactly what we've been dealing with for all of these years. So perhaps we can have a follow-up hearing where we can get some more specific answers, or maybe you guys got some more specific answers before I got here. But saying that maybe in May, then the FDA is going to know when they might have a plan, this is part of, and this is a very tough issue. I understand this is a very tough issue. It's tough getting people to take these jobs, but on the other hand, the security of our drug system and our food system that's coming from abroad is at stake here, and these are not answers, so thank you.
If I could just clarify one thing. So they have created a plan. We are reviewing it, and we should hopefully have an answer as to whether it's sufficient or not by May. But I will clarify that and make sure we get answers to you.
And I will say to the gentlelady that we do anticipate additional hearings because of this importance, and I look forward to working with you and other members on both sides of the aisle, because we're just trying to solve problems. It's not about beating up on the FDA.
Exactly, thank you.
Not that occasionally we can't do that, but in most part. All right, so I do think we may have one other person coming back. So in the meantime, Ranking Member Castor and I are going to ask a few follow-up questions or some additional questions that we didn't get to in our original 5 minutes. If we complete and nobody else is here, then we'll close out the hearing if that's okay with you all. All right, so Mr. Thakur, you have told us in your testimony about recurrent reports of data destruction. You said that in your opening, talked about and I may have gotten it somewhat wrong, but the barrel with shredded documents in it that they were pouring acid on, and falsification by foreign manufacturers, particularly in India and China and so forth. And you've given us some answers on that, criminal penalties possibly, and certainly, maybe more penalties on not being able to import, I think was one of Mr. Claud's responses to that. But let me ask you an adjacent but slightly different question. Are you aware of any allegations related to bribery or offers that foreign countries have made to FDA foreign inspectors in order to subvert the FDA inspection process?
Chairman Griffith, I don't have data to substantiate this, but there is a record of this in the book Bottle of Lies about an FDA inspector actually of Indian origin trying to help the industry. Now, whether there was money changed hands, I have no idea. But the notion that the US FDA inspector would go on to try and help the industry of the persons that are responsible inspecting, that just doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah, it doesn't seem right to me either. And what was the reference you made?
The book Bottle of Lies by Catherine Eban. John probably has a...
Okay, he does. I just thought we'd get it out there on the record. Mr. Claud, you have anything?
I don't have any information about that. FDA, as part of its training on this matter, I am confident, instructs its employees about the ramifications of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but other than that, I don't have anything to.
And I don't know the accuracy of it, but as I was looking into this, I heard a report that there was somebody who took a trip to the Great Wall of China while somebody else did the inspection, or the so-called inspection.
Well, that's another hurdle that we're trying to jump over here, right? Is that is there a way to have some sort of indigenous inspection that's done, and that is where FDA should rely, I think, on the pillars of the countries that share the same regulatory viewpoint identifying the higher risk areas and devoting more resources there as appropriate.
So what you're saying is shift our foreign inspectors from the lower risk countries to the higher risk countries, without naming which ones are low and which ones are high.
Exactly, but I'll give you a quick example.
Yes, sir.
I have a client who was inspected by FDA and then made remediations and then got a clean certificate of compliance from a European inspector. We are still waiting for FDA to resolve that inspection. And there's no fault. I know the inspector turnover has left the agency, and so there's all kinds of explanations for it. These are the kinds of complexities that this problem unfolds. It's not just getting the inspections done in the first place, it's then doing the follow-ups and resolving them.
And Ms. Denigan-Macauley, you actually know a little bit about that too, that they're not following up. They go in, they find their problems, and then they don't go back to do the follow-up inspection as they would in the U.S. fairly quickly.
Written documentation is more common.
Okay. All right. My concept that I floated earlier, I would just tell you, I've gotten to like it more and more as time goes by. It's been a couple hours. But my concept would be is that we take students that have just graduated when they're 22, 23, on just the cleanliness issue, not the fraud, not the chemical stuff. We give them a couple weeks of training, then we send them in country at a low stipend amount but cover their travel expenses. I mean, I just know when I was that age, if somebody had given me an opportunity to travel in India or China, and, you know, I worked Monday through Friday hard, but then had a couple of days on the weekends, and maybe we send them 2 by 2 because I know that it can be intimidating in foreign countries. But it seems to me we could lower our costs and at least get eyes on the situation to determine if we need to clean up or make this plant a priority in a country that may be at risk. All right, with that, I'm going to yield now to Ms. Castor for some follow-up questions, and if nobody's here when she finishes, and I was hoping one more would show up, but if not, then we do appreciate you, and we will move on.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Denigan-Macauley, talk to us about now what is on GAO's plate. What is what's on your to-do list on this subject? We know the workforce issues we're very interested in. You've heard from members how the unannounced inspections ramp up. This idea of working with out-of-country inspectors, especially with allied nations. What can we expect from GAO? Also anticipating that we're going to have FDA in to talk about this too.
Yeah, I could wish we were back in about the May timeframe. We are actively looking at all of this. We're looking at the use of the alternative tools. You know, we talked about sampling. We talked about remote interactions. You know, what are some of the challenges? What are foreign regulators using? What is the FDA doing in comparison? We're also looking at workforce very closely. I mean, that's always subject of all of our reports because it is a key problem that they have. Getting an update on where we stand on the vacancies and the tools and strategies that they have in place to be able to not only, as I mentioned before, to attract, but then also to retain, working with OPM, working with ORA, CEDAR, so the whole gamut there. We're also very interested in the pilot programs. They need to stop relying on translators, and they need to make sure that the inspections are equivalent to here that we have in the United States. We feel very strongly about that.
Are you also following the DOD study where they on mandatory testing?
So I don't believe that the DOD is part of the actual review that we're looking at. Our focus is on FDA. However, we'd be happy to look at that as well. Clearly, it's all hands on deck. I mean, COVID has showed us that, right? The supply chain is no longer just one agency. FDA used to be responsible for doing drug shortages. They're not anymore. There's now a new HHS coordinator that's been appointed. We have ongoing work looking at that as well. The extent to which they're coordinating with DOD and VA, and I mean, it's a much bigger. It is not just a public health, but it is a homeland security concern.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. I yield back.
Generally yields back, and I think we all agree the FDA, as Mr. Claud said in his opening, the FDA people are by and far trying to do the best they can. We just have to figure out how to make them a little quicker and a little more agile in some areas. But I know they're trying to do a tough job. That being said, seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I would like to thank the witnesses again for being here today. This is very important, and we probably will have another hearing. I hope that we will, so that we can get updates and continue to monitor this situation. At this time, I would ask for unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I would ask the witnesses that when we get those questions to you, that you respond within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. Without objection, committee is adjourned.